Steve Allain, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm actually very excited because you're the first scientist I've been able to interview so far that specializes in vertebrates.
Interesting, wonderful. What a
Yeah.
privilege.
Well, I'm excited. So, you are a herpetologist. And so, what exactly is a herpetologist for somebody who doesn't know what that is?
So, despite what your preconceived notions are, a herpetologist is somebody that studies reptiles and amphibians. So, everything from frogs to snakes, lizards, crocodiles, newts, salamanders, and turtles.
Oh, I should have realized that it also included crocodiles. Now, there are no crocodiles in England, are there?
There aren't any, no, not presently, unfortunately, but a few million years ago, I think there were. I think there are fossils of them around from the Jurassic. But yeah, currently there aren't any. No, I wish there were, but it's one of those things that as a child, when you're out exploring the wilderness and you watch a National Geographic documentary, and you're like, oh yeah, I wish I could see that in my local neighborhood, and you never do. That's the the kind of mentality that I've got towards these animals. Obviously, if crocodiles were here and they were introduced, it would probably cause chaos for our natural ecosystems. But a boy can always dream.
Exactly. So I want to actually deep dive into something that I know you're very familiar with, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but it's called chytrid, I believe, the
Chytrid fungus,
fungus.
yes.
Chytrid, yeah.
There
So
are
I
different
actually heard.
pronunciations. Don't worry.
Okay, great. I actually heard about it because my partner pointed it out one time. We were visiting a pond and these frogs weren't moving very much. And so she was like, I think they might have some sort of parasite because she had heard about it probably in a documentary or a book. And so I wanted to jump in because to me, I find this overly fascinating. And I know that you're a specialist in fungus and diseases. So why don't you tell me a little bit? What is Chytrid and what does it
Okay.
do?
No, sure. So Chytrid is as somebody that has spent the past few years before moving on to reptiles studying amphibians, it is my worst nightmare. Uh, it's a fungal pathogen which infects the skin of amphibians and causes hyperkeratinization. And for amphibians such as frogs and salamanders, their skin is their most vital organ. So they use it to breathe, they use it to uptake water, they use it to exchange electrolytes, and a whole host of different functions. Obviously, in some species, they use it to secrete poisons and toxins. They use it for sexual display. There's a whole host of functions of amphibian skin that probably warrant their own podcast alone. And what Chytrid does is it disrupts these functions. It causes it to become uh, a lot harder and less permeable than it would be otherwise. And essentially, the frogs, the newts, the salamanders, whatever amphibians are infected, unfortunately, usually die of cardiac arrest following infection because they just can't continue function. They can't function the way they should do, and yeah, uh, they die that way. The different species, die at different loads of the chytrid fungus to other species. The neotropical species in South America tend to be more susceptible than those in the North America or in Europe. But yes, there's lots of evidence to suggest that chytrid fungus has at least been implemented in the decline of 500 to 1,000 amphibian species and the extinction of potentially 200 or more.
Wow. Have you seen it actively in England?
I haven't, no. So I've been swabbing amphibians for a few years now, and we've also, we've taken this past native species, but also looking at non-native species as well. And everything that we've tested so far has come back negative. Obviously, that doesn't mean it's not here. More larger landscape scale projects have shown that there are pockets of chytrid around England, Wales, and Scotland, and other places in Great Britain. So yes, it's here, and at the moment it appears to only have a limited effect on our native species, probably because they're more resilient to fluctuations in temperature and pollution and everything else. So that probably helps them, when it comes to disease. But with climate change, with ongoing habitat loss, with smaller population sizes, and everything that's predicted for the future, this element of disease being present in populations may be a significant driving force towards localized, if not national, extinctions, which is the scary bit.
Okay, yeah, I bet. I just want to interrupt our conversation just really quickly here, just to tell our listeners that Steve is in the UK. I'm in Canada, so our connection is a little bit interesting this evening. There are a few words that perhaps we won't be able to make out properly, but I think we're getting the gist of it, which is that this fungus is a threat, not just in the southern hemisphere, but also in Great Britain. Do you know anything about the chytrid in North America, specifically in Canada?
So in North America, it's been found in a few species. The main one, which probably won't surprise anybody, is the American bullfrog, and so the American bullfrog has been introduced to lots of areas outside of its natural range, mainly for the production of frog legs for food and culinary dishes. And because of that, because they're asymptomatic carriers of Chytrid, they've been able to spread it to other populations of more susceptible and naive populations. And yes, this has caused declines, as well as those bullfrogs outcompeting the other amphibian species either directly or through predation. Disease, is the final nail in the coffin, and so as well as the American bullfrog, there's a few other of the green frogs that are also highly susceptible to infection, although they don't seem to be that affected by it, which means that they can then go on and spread the disease around their environment uh, to species that are more vulnerable to infection. And the green frogs don't exhibit any levels of population decline or loss, whereas these more susceptible species do, which is worrying, and is very reminiscent of what's going on at the moment with the current COVID-19 crisis. Is that you've got these asymptomatic carriers going around and potentially spreading disease to susceptible populations or groups of people in the case of the pandemic, without any evidence of being able to track them unless you're testing every single one of them, which is both painstakingly expensive and also labor intensive as well.
Yeah, I bet. And so is Chytrid in any way, shape, or form dangerous to humans as well?
It's not dangerous to humans whatsoever. No, thankfully, it's one of those diseases that I doubt will ever jump to people. Amphibians are highly susceptible because of the levels of keratin in their skin, and as I said earlier, it's their major organ. In our skin, we do have keratin, but most of our keratin is in our fingernails and our hair. In our skin, we also have collagen and other proteins that also uh, play vital roles that you don't find those proteins in amphibian skin. So yes, they are highly susceptible, whereas you know human skin, laboratory studies have shown that chytrid spores, they die very quickly when in contact with human skin, due to either the lack of a suitable you know area to bed down, or just due to our microbiome. It's a lot more or hostile to the fungus than amphibians.
Now, I know that in humans, treating fungal infections can be pretty difficult and it usually comes with a lot of side effects. How does it work in amphibians? Is there a way to treat a frog that's got this fungus?
There are some ways, but unfortunately, the issue is that they're not 100% guaranteed all the time in every different species. So there are some fungicidal agents that you can dilute down into different dilute quantities, and place your froggy or salamander in, and treat them over the course of a few days or a few weeks. And this seems to work most of the time. But obviously, doing that on a population scale, over a continent, it is impossible, particularly when the fungus itself can persist in the environment even after you've cured the infection in an individual. There seems to be very limited immunity gained by these individuals, and so they're liable to be reinfected almost immediately after being placed back in the wild.
Man, I'm so fascinated by this. And I'm really curious now because I'm wondering, is there a way to eradicate it or are they or are amphibians essentially at the mercy of this?
So this is an interesting question, and the first thoughts of what Chytrid was were first discussed in the 1989 World Congress of Herpetology held here in Canterbury, and amphibian biologists around the world were meeting for the first time to discuss the fact that they'd been out for years and years, and all these amphibian populations were nice and stable, and then they went back one year and they just suddenly disappeared. And it wasn't until 1998, so 22 years ago, that we discovered the amphibian chytrid fungus. And despite that amount of time, there's still so much about it we don't understand. And at the moment, it does seem like most populations are at the mercy of the fungus. Although in some places, because of the high rate of turnover in some amphibian species, they are managing to adapt and evolve immunity to the fungus. But this isn't always the case. And unfortunately, it looks like that chytrid is going to be the cause of decline slash extinction of a whole host of different amphibians around the world for at least the next century, because we have no way really to mitigate it in the wild, apart from just spraying fungicide everywhere, which obviously isn't the best for the environment. Because of the symbiotic relationship between fungi and plants and other animals and everything else. So it's a tough one, and obviously the removal of amphibians from the environment affects the whole of the food chain. As I'm sure you're aware and the listeners are aware, frogs and newts tend to play the numbers game. They don't just have one, two offspring like most mammals; they lay thousands of eggs, and each of those tadpoles, is food for birds, mammals, reptiles, other amphibians, etc. And if you remove that food source, then unfortunately those predators are also going to suffer, and it has knock-on effects all the way down the food chain, which can be traced back to the reduction in frog populations.
Yeah, it seems like such a terrifying prospect. I'm glad at least we know about it. I guess there's nothing really much that the average person can do about it, can they?
Unfortunately, not no, but depending where you are in the world, if you suspect that a frog is sick, or at least an amphibian is sick, there are different recording schemes to be able to, to record sick and dying wildlife, and obviously that can help alert people that are working in the disease sector what's going on and where the spread of these diseases may be, and that is probably the best early warning system we have at the moment, is trying to figure out how far spread these diseases are, which species they're infecting, and where they're found. Because chytrid isn't the only infectious disease that's affecting amphibians. There's a whole host of them, which is the scary prospect is in the past 20, 30 years, we've found a whole host of these infectious diseases that are hitting amphibians left, right, and centre. And unfortunately, they are suffering the consequences, which is a shame, particularly to someone who loves, going to a pond and seeing thousands of frogs having a fun time.
Yeah, it's actually a great segue because my next question was about there's apparently a parasite that causes frogs to grow extra legs.
Yes. So this was discovered in the US in the 60s, I believe, and it's the intermediate host of the parasite is frogs. So it infects a snail first, then a frog, and then a water bird such as a heron. And so the frogs eat the snails. The parasites enter the tadpoles or the young frogs. They grow extra legs, and because of that, they're more liable to predation by herons and other bird predators that you find in wetlands, and then the parasite can enter those birds and complete their life cycle. So yes, there's a great documentary and a great book on this very subject, and I believe they're both titled "The Plague of Frogs." Uh, and yeah, it's interesting to just look at how the scientific discourse and the thought process of these people that were studying these frogs went, because went from looking at nuclear fallout and environmental waste to parasites very quickly after that everything else checked out to be pretty okay. But obviously when it comes to those sorts of environmental contaminants, amphibians are quite susceptible, because they absorb everything through their skin, and yes, it's one of those things that I guess if you were studying this for the first time, it must have been very daunting. But like with Chytrid, it's great to know what's going on, so we can try to do something in the future to mitigate it. And thankfully, we do know what's going on, and yeah, it's one of those things that it still manages to freak people out from time to time, and it's very natural. But at least we have a handle of what's going on, which helps us understand the whole natural process of everything there.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so the birds consume the frogs with the extra legs. Now what happens to the bird, do you know?
So the bird, as far as I'm aware, is perfectly fine. So the parasitic worms use the stomachs of the birds as their place to breed and release their eggs, which then end up back in the water in their feces, and then the snails eat them, and then the snails are eaten by the frogs, and that whole process continues. So the birds are unaffected in this whole process. It's just the frogs that are more susceptible to predation through the production of the extra legs, which yeah, it is quite an interesting strategy when you think about parasites, because usually they don't tend to cause their hosts to grow extra limbs or anything like that. Yes, like the cordyceps fungus, as I'm sure some of you will have known or seen with ants, they grow these huge spore-like antennae after the ants grown to the top of a climb to the top of a tree or a long blade of grass, and then releases its spores there. So there are some parasites that can affect the behavior of their animals, but not many that can change their anatomy, which I think is truly fascinating in itself.
That is absolutely wild, actually. I've got shivers. Uh, Steve, why did you become so interested in this? I mean, now I get it, but I'm curious about you, your story. Why frogs? Why specifically fungus and pathogens?
Uh, to be fair, I just never grew up. I was always chasing frogs around. When I was a child, and I'm still doing it 20 years later. And it's one of those things that when you go through this whole level of professional development, uh, you start to realize that the species that you love aren't going to be around forever, and there are threats affecting them. So I got involved with disease because to me that seemed like one of the biggest threats that I could help understand with relation to the declines of amphibians in my local area. Uh, as it goes, the largest decline of amphibians worldwide is habitat loss, as it probably is for most species. But yeah, when I first got involved, uh, in academia 8 years ago, the disease side of amphibians was still relatively new. And during the course of my undergraduate degree, the second amphibian chytrid fungus was discovered, the one that infects salamanders, which has been given the shortened title of B cell, but its scientific name is Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans, or the devourer of newts. And here in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and Germany, it has caused huge declines in fire salamanders and uh, other newt species. Thankfully, so far it's absent from the US and Canada. But the worry is that it could easily spread there. And the Appalachian Mountains, which I'm not sure if many people will be aware of, are the salamander hotspot of the world. So if this new fungus that originated in Asia spreads to the Appalachians, it could be lights out for 150 or more species of salamanders. The example is the European fire salamander, and in the Netherlands, over the course of 6 years, their populations crashed by 99.99% because of the introduction of this fungus. Uh, and again, like with BD, it eats their skin, it compromises their immune systems, and they die of lethargy and cardiac arrest. So yeah, the disease side of things, as much as they're scary, and they're sort of the enemy from a really bad Doctor Who episode. They're also interesting to learn about how to combat, and I think it's that curiosity that despite all of the depressing outcomes and potentials, keeps me moving forward. Because hopefully we'll be able to find a way to save the animals that I love from these diseases and reverse these trends that we're seeing.
It sounds like a beautiful vocation for you. You mentioned really quickly that habitat loss is a major threat to amphibians. I remember doing an interview with a conservation biologist, and his specialty was bees and pollinators. And so I asked him, uh, if I buy a property, what's the best way for me to help them, in terms of the habitat, preserve the preservation of their habitat. I'm going to ask you the same question. What's the best way, if I move out into the countryside, for me to preserve the habitat in my yard? Is it helpful to build perhaps a pond?
Exactly, yes. Build a pond and also keep an area of long, rough grass somewhere. So, there's lots of misconceptions about amphibians, and, the correct one, is that most people know that amphibians need ponds to breeding, which is great, but they don't spend their whole life or the whole year in a pond. Adults come to the ponds, at least in temperate climates, to breed in the spring and then leave shortly afterwards, and will hunt around for insects, for earthworms, for other invertebrates in long grass somewhere, and then find somewhere to bed down for the winter. And then, in the summertime, the tadpoles will have metamorphosed into froglets and toadlets or tiny newts and salamanders, and they'll be joining the adults. So yes, build a pond, but also leave an area of rough grass somewhere. And if you are going to build a pond, uh, please stock it with native vegetation, that is appropriate to your location, so that there's no issues there with invasive species or anything, and so that the amphibians that do find it can make good use of it. And so, yeah, obviously that will depend on where you live, but you can usually find sort of handy guide to this stuff online or in your local garden centre, or you know the general sorts of places that you find this kind of information.
Is it okay for people to handle frogs?
It's perfectly okay for people to handle frogs. Although if you're going to, wear gloves or make sure your hands are wet first, the issue is that if you're handling them with dry hands, there is the potential that you can give them burns, because obviously we're a lot warmer than they are, and also uh, there's the potential to spread disease between individuals as well. So it's best to try to wear gloves at all times, but if you can't, make sure your hands are at least wet so that you mitigate the effect of the burns. But yeah, like I do lots of outreach with school groups, and I always encourage children to handle these animals. It's one of those things that because they move in such a weird way compared to everything else that they see in the environment, they tend to scare people a little. Like when my family dog is completely terrified of frogs. Anything else, he'll happily just sit there and look at. But frogs, scare the daylights out of him. Uh, but yes, handle frogs, handle salamanders. But if you're going to do it, please wear gloves. Make sure your hands are moist, and make sure it's under the supervision of an adult or somebody that knows what's going on, just in case things do go wrong. The last thing we want is somebody to accidentally squish a frog in their hands whilst they're trying to admire their beauty.
Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in the countryside in northern Ontario. So, forests, lakes and stuff like that. And I always grabbed frogs. I've always grabbed frogs without, making sure my hands were wet. So, this is very good information. I'm definitely not going to handle a frog with a dry hand ever again. So, thank you for that.
No, no, no.
Uh
It's one of those things that I did the very same thing. I grew up in a suburban part of England, and yes, there were lots of wild spaces around me. But it's one of those things, as you grow older and more wise in these things, you start to realise that the behaviours and the actions that you take or used to take, could be creating detrimental effects. And now, when I'm handling amphibians, I'm always wearing gloves, or at least if I'm working within the same population, my hands are always wet.
okay. Well, I mean, like I said, it's something that now that I know, I can also tell my friends and family too, It's one of those things the information just spreads.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
I have also I have a huge fascination actually with toads. I find them just beautiful, even though a lot of people, in fairy tales are considered very grotesque. There's all sorts of myths around them, which we know are not true. Like, they give you warts, for example. At least I don't think it's true. Is it true?
It's not true at all. No, it's one of those
Okay.
things that I handled so many toads as a child that I should be covered in warts, but I've never had a single incidence of a wart. So I am evidence right there. But yes, there are lots of myths about them, and I think some of them date back to the Middle Ages because obviously they were seen as familiars of witches, and there's all sorts of tales in Shakespeare and other texts that relate toads and uh, their somewhat ugliness to Satanism, or at least the black magic side of things. And yes, there is this whole misconception about them, which I always try to to crush when I speak to children about them and other people. Toads play an important part in the food system. They hoover up a whole host of potentially parasitic insects, as well as ones that spread disease, such as mosquitoes, as do frogs. And really, they are our friends just because we have these preconceived notions about what they do, and how unimportant they are. They can easily be turned around, by showing people just how important they are, and by having some hands-on experience. I find it always helps.
For toads, what I've noticed about them is that a lot of times I see them in very dry environments, not like in a lake or in a pond. Is that because they prefer the warmth or the
So
dryness?
with toads, yes. So you tend to find frogs, basking on the edges of ponds, or if not in the pond, soaking up the sunshine and the water at the same time. So they tend to be the people that are enjoying, the pool during the summer, and the toads are the guys that are, a little bit more apprehensive and trying to hide from the UV rays and just laying low. They're still enjoying the weather, but they're undercover, or a little bit further away from all of the action. And the reason being is that toads themselves are uh, they're more resilient to desiccation, to drying out, and so they can tolerate those conditions. And so I often find them in log piles and other bits and pieces. When just trying to move up rubbish and trash around the garden, or when you're doing some habitat work in a woodland, and you're trying to build a habitat for these guys, and accidentally find out that you've disturbed one in a in a semi habitat for them. And yes, so toads prefer the drier but still damp and cool environments compared to frogs. Although when it comes to breeding, they'll be in the ponds just as much as the frogs are. But as soon as that breeding's over, they'll be off and out, and seeking somewhere to shelter.
Okay, so other than those differences, then in terms of preference as to where they like to hide or be out in the sun, what else is different between frogs and toads?
So this is an interesting question, and it's one that I am often asked. So it depends on what you define as a toad. So toads, scientifically belong to the family Bufonidae, which is the true toads. So here in the UK we have Bufo, which is the common toad, and Epidele calamita, which is the natterjack toad. And those are two quintessential toad species. In the US and Canada, there's a whole host of other species that used to belong to the Bufo genus, but have now been split up into different genre. And so the main differences between frogs and toads is that frogs have smooth skin and toads have bumpy skin. Toads also have a set of bean-shaped glands behind their eyes, on the back of their head slash necks, where they produce their toxins, called parotoid glands. Uh, and so these are only in those true toads. Although in most languages there is no distinguishing word between frogs and toads, and so yeah, throughout most of the Inurans, which are frogs and toads, of which there's about 7,200 species currently recognised by science, you can use the term frog or toad interchangeably, apart from those few species that are in the Buffonid family. So it's a very complex question. It doesn't have a simple answer. Uh, but yes, if you want to distinguish a frog from a toad, check its skin. Is it warty? Is it smooth? Does it have these parotid glands? And the other thing is that toads tend to crawl, whereas frogs tend to hop. Uh, and so yes, if it gets a bit of speed going on it, is it hopping across the lawn, or is it just crawling slowly through the grass? And that can help you distinguish whether or not it's a frog or a toad.
Thanks about that. Steve, I have an absurd question for you, but I have to ask just because I'm super curious. We were talking about our mutual French heritage before we started recording, and I was curious, would you ever eat a frog?
I wouldn't know, and the same is when it comes to crocodiles and other uh, you know reptiles or amphibians that are often seen on the menu. And there are two reasons for that. One, I'm a vegetarian. I believe you can't save animals and eat them at the same time. And the second thing is that yeah, I don't think I could stomach eating an animal that I love so much. Without forcing it down myself and then possibly puking up afterwards. So yeah, I'd give it a miss and enjoy a more traditional dish and a beer instead.
Yeah, I kind of figured that would be the answer, but I figured I'd ask anyway. Another creature that you seem to enjoy studying is the snake, essentially. Um, so, what is it in particular about snakes that you find absolutely fascinating?
I think there's lots of crazy things that I find fascinating with snakes, but the main one is that they're so diverse, despite the fact they've all got the basic body plan of a head with a long neck and body and a short tail, and obviously they vary in size massively. From you know a few centimeters up to 10 meters in length and everything in between. And they've colonized and adapted to a whole host of environments, from right into the Arctic Circle to tropical oceans to deserts to mountain ranges, to marshlands. So there are snakes literally everywhere, and that to me just blows my mind. Particularly here in England, you don't tend to see many snakes unless you look in the right places. They tend to be quite shy. They tend to be quite timid. And when I tell people that I'm studying snakes here in England, uh, you get a lot of confused looks because, like, there's no snakes in England. I'm like, yes, there is. You just have to look in the right place, uh, or at least know what you're looking for to begin with. And yes, snakes are fun. Unfortunately, there are a small fraction of them that are medically significant and can cause death. So unless you know what you're doing, don't handle snakes or pick them up unless you're 100% certain on the ID. If you're bitten by a venomous snake, seek medical attention as soon as possible. Uh, but yes, thankfully the species that I'm studying is non-venomous, and the worst thing it's going to do is defecate all over you and pretend to be dead. Which is humorous, and it's wonderful for trying to collect fecal samples for dietary analysis. Uh, but yeah, it's tough to try to I'm a one man band when it comes to all of my data collection, so it's hard to try to collect everything and measure the snake and take photographs and swab it and everything, whilst I've only got two hands to restrain it and do that all at the same time.
Yeah, I bet. Um, I want to touch on something you just said, though, that kind of astounded me. There are snakes in the Arctic, or do you mean
Yes,
underwater? Maybe.
so the only venomous snake species we have here in the UK is the northern adder, Viperobarus. Uh, and yes, they're found way up into the Arctic Circle, along with one of our lizard species, Zootoca vivipara, the viviparous lizard. And both of these species give birth to live young. They incubate their eggs internally and then give birth to live young. Uh, the reason being is an adaptation to the cold. If you're a reptile, why would you lay your eggs in the snow where they're going to freeze when you can, bask in the open and incubate those young until they're ready to leave you, and then go off and do their own thing. So yes, I'm not sure if there's any snakes in the Arctic on the Canadian side of things, but at least in Europe, there are adders in the Arctic Circle, which is crazy. And whenever I tell people, it blows their mind. But yes, Viperibarus has one of the largest distribution range of any species in the world. Its range is it's right across Asia, through Russia, Asia, all the way over to Japan. It's got a huge range, uh, adapted to a huge range of environments. But it wouldn't surprise me, if in a few years' time, because of that range, that the species is broken down into a number of different species. Uh, because yeah, obviously some of them may have become adapted to different conditions compared to some of the other locations, so much so that they can be regarded as a new species. Uh, but yeah,
Steve, do you know what these Arctic adders, what do they eat up there?
so this is a very good question. Do they feed primarily on small mammals? So I can only assume that lemmings and mice and that kind of thing. So yeah,
Okay.
obviously,
Wow, and is it
sorry.
well, I was gonna ask you what actually eats the snake after that?
Uh, I think it depends. Here in England, it varies. Birds of prey tend to be a big predator, as do introduced pheasants for for shooting for sport. But foxes, cats, dogs, all these sorts of animals tend to predate on them as well. So I assume in the Arctic, predators such as the Arctic fox and snowy owls and all those sorts of things opportunistically will take them as well. Uh, Particularly as some of the adders in the Arctic Circle are melanistic, so they're completely black, which obviously, if you're on a white background, gives you a thermal advantage to collect solar energy to warm up and to incubate your young. Uh, but yeah, that obviously makes them stand out like a sore thumb to predators, which may increase the risk of predation to visually orientated predators such as owls and foxes.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's not a very smart adaptation, but like you said, they need it for collecting warmth. That I guess would make sense. Uh, the other thing that you study with snakes is snake fungal disease. Tell me about that.
Okay, so this is an interesting topic. So recently, in the scientific literature, snake fungal disease has undergone a name change. It's now known as ophidiomycosis, uh, with mycosis denoting a fungal disease, and ophidio being a Greek root word for snake. Hence, ophidiophobia if you suffer from a fear of snakes. And here in Europe, very little is known about it. Hopefully, I can help fill in some of those gaps as I go throughout my PhD. I've still got a few years left yet, so don't look at me at the moment for any answers. But in the US, where the disease has been known about since 2009 and been studied more, uh, yes, the situation seems to be similar to the chytrid fungus we discussed earlier, but on a much smaller localized scale. Only a few species seem to be, susceptible to infection and suffer subsequent death, which is interesting. But we do know that infection changes the behavior uh, of infected snakes, which may lead to indirect mortality from infection through increased risk of predation and other such factors. So yeah, it's one of those emerging diseases that they tend. Well, there's been a number over the past couple of decades: chytrid fungus, B cell, white nose syndrome in bats, phaidomycosis. The list just keeps going on and on and on. And I'm not sure if these diseases have been there, most of the time, and we've only just noticed them, or if they are truly introduced. But I imagine it's a combination of two factors. An increased alertness and awareness of fungal diseases means that when we're out and about looking at wildlife populations, if something looks a bit iffy, we can then test those animals that are infected or at least look sick to see what's going on. And then if a new fungal pathogen is found there, then job done. We can start to study that. Uh, but at least with ophidiomycosis, there's some evidence to suggest that the infections here in Europe and those in the US are independent of one another genetically. So it appears that there are at least two different strains of the fungus. So it may have been sitting dormant in the environment for God knows how long, and has only just become apparent due to our increased awareness of fungal pathogens or climate change or habitat loss or other stresses on snake populations that have made them more susceptible to infection compared to 10, 15 years ago.
Wow, that's I don't know. You've essentially made me both terrified for the health of the snakes and the frogs. I mean, we've been talking about all these diseases that are just, you know, taking over their population. Is there any good news in terms of the health of amphibians and snakes and reptiles in general? Is there anything that you've seen that's kind of optimistic?
There is some stuff that's optimistic. I think the issue is when it comes to conservation, things tend to be quite depressing very quickly. And I'm not sure, if you or any of the listeners have seen the new David Attenborough film, A Life on Our Planet. But the whole story of that film pretty much sums up what it's like to work in conservation. It gets quite depressing for a long time, but then there is some optimism. When it comes to chytrid and amphibians in the neotropics in South America, there is evidence to suggest that some species that declined in the 80s have gained some resistance and are bouncing back, which is great. Uh, Despite the fact that the threat of chytrid fungus is still there, which it is something which we all hoped would happen. When it comes to these thousands and millions of frogs, disappearing, you'd hope that at least one of them, or at least a couple of them, had some level of immunity that could then spread throughout the population and proliferate afterwards. It appears that that's happening. There are a whole host of different successful reintroduction programs of different amphibian and reptile species around the world going on, by teams of very dedicated and hardworking volunteers and professionals. And at this moment in time, as far as I'm aware, there are more people working in reptile and amphibian conservation than any other time in the past. Uh, so there are lots of great young minds, trying to crack these problems and find solutions for a whole host of different issues. Some that we haven't even covered yet, uh, as well as the disease stuff and habitat loss, and trying to figure out how to translocate populations to save them from climate change, or how to cryopreserve species for longevity should you need to create clones, or artificially inseminate a species to save it from extinction, etc. So yeah, it's one of those things that, yes, conservation in terms of reptiles and amphibians is depressing, particularly when you look at the disease side of things, because there isn't much we can do at the moment. We've only recently discovered these pathogens. But on the grand scheme of things, I'm very optimistic, because there are so many people trying to find solutions, and they're all working together as well, which is a great thing. There's not this great rift where people are fighting to find a solution. People are collaborating like they never did before. And that to me is a sure sign of progress if I ever saw one.
Yeah, there's quite the movement right now too for science communication. It's such a hot topic right now. Is scientists kind of learning the skills and also becoming interested in communicating about science with the public. Now, I have done my research on you, and I do know that you are quite entrepreneurial as well, in the sense that you kind of it seems that you're doing this as a personal venture as well, to kind of educate the public, to teach kids. You have a Patreon account, you have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you have your own shop, you do all sorts of podcasts. Is this something that is essentially a personal venture?
It is, yes. So you know, this to me is, a personal venture, is a hobby, to try to get people involved and infused about the natural world, whether it be amphibians, mammals, birds, insects, whatever. I focus primarily on reptiles and amphibians because, that is where my passion lies. But, I try to get people involved and infused wherever I can. Everybody's different. At the moment, I'm still feeding the curiosity and the passion of my inner 6-year-old of learning about Tyrannosaurus Rex and everything else. I haven't lost that or let go of that. And so here in England, at least, a lot of 6 and 7-year-old kids are pretty clued up when it comes to the natural world. That they know so much more than many adults do. It's surprising. It seriously is. But somewhere along along the the journey to becoming an adult, they lose that spark. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to keep that spark ignited, by throwing extra kindling and logs onto the fire to make sure that these people can follow those passions, because they will be the conservationists of the future. And to me, that's the most important thing. So yes, everything that I do, uh, it is voluntary. I'm trying to get people involved because no matter how hard us as scientists work, we can't do things alone. We need the support and the cooperation of the general public. We need them to understand what's going on. We need to understand them how they can help, and we need them to understand how their daily life is impacting the species that we're trying to protect and preserve. Uh, and hopefully, we can work together as a massive unit to, to create this, this super network of people that are working all around the globe to help protect and preserve every aspect of the natural world, whether it be frogs or bats or shrimps or whales or whatever. And that is my ultimate goal, is trying to get people connected with the natural world so that they'll actually fight for it when the time comes.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying because you're saying you never grew up, and I actually can really, really relate to that. And one of the things I found, now I do a microscopic live stream on Twitch, and one of the things that I've found is that grown-ups are the ones who are watching it. People over 40. And what I find interesting about that is that there is a yearning to connect with their youth, with that sense of exploration. Now, I consider you, getting to know you for the past hour or so, as kind of like the Peter Pan, perhaps, of academia. Do you find, is there a struggle with keeping that enthusiasm in a milieu that tends to be a bit stuffy sometimes?
It can be difficult, yes. I think this year has been a challenge for us all, and certainly in terms of academic challenges, but also personal ones as well. And there are times when I thought about just you know holding up my hands and saying maybe this isn't the right thing, and then 2 seconds later I completely disagree with myself and keep on going. uh, there is the issue of growing up, but I think I'm always finding new ways to satisfy my inner curiosity. I read a lot. At the moment I'm reading a book on dinosaurs, because why not. And it's one of those things that there's so much to learn about life, whether it be our own biology, our physiology, how we're related to other species, how those species interplay with other species, previous life on Earth, uh, the future of life on Earth. There are so many different ways you can look at things just from that angle alone, without even going into astronomy or chemistry or physics or whatever. That uh, whenever I feel a little bit disconnected from the world, I just take a step back, look at the bigger picture, and think, okay, how can I get back to where I want to be, as opposed to being where I am now? And yeah, just tend to listen to some chill music, read a book, and then find my way back where I want to be.
You mentioned books and being an avid book reader. I visited your blog and I really, really love it. And what I enjoy about you, Steve, is that you do book reviews, which is
Yes.
fantastic. You also reviewed David Attenborough's latest film as well. What are, let's say, your top three favorite books, whether it be science or
Ooh.
history, whatever? What are your top three?
This is a tough one. I think
I figured.
my, my top three books. So one of them would be Life in Cold Blood by Richard Kerridge. So it's a book about Richard's early life growing up here in England, spending the 70s and the 60s, uh, chasing reptiles and amphibians as a young boy around southern England. And despite the fact, I'm a few decades younger than him, I still had, similar experiences growing up. And so, I can connect with that on so many levels. And hopefully people that, are in the same field as I, for that same connection. The second book that I think is just mind blowing is The Unexpected Truth About Animals by Lucy Cook. And this explores a whole host of different species of which we have incorrect preconceived notions about, and sets those straight, whether that whether they stem from incorrect information collected uh, by early European explorers to the New World, or whether that's just through myths and legends that have been passed down through the ages. And then my third book would be The Secret Network of Nature by Peter Wohlleben, which is part of a trilogy of books, which looks at how different species are, uh, they're connected to one another in an ecosystem and how they all interplay. And reading that book, uh, you know, as an ecologist, didn't really, uh, you know, teach me anything new, but it did reinforce what I've seen, what I've learned, and everything else. And obviously, if you're not from that kind of background, then you're going to be able to appreciate nature in a whole different light. And I think that's the most important thing with some of these books is that yes, uh, they're written by scientists, but they're written in a very accessible format, which helps connect people with the natural world, and do some of the hard work that I'm trying to do without even trying. You read these books, and you can easily storm through them in a day. Or maybe less. I'm not sure how fast everybody reads, but yeah, they're highly enjoyable, and it's that kind of book where you get to the end and you wish there was more, but unfortunately there isn't.
Is that one of your aspirations?
To write a book,
Yeah, to write a book.
uh, I do like writing, and yeah, I'd love to write a book at some point. I've got some great stories to share at the moment, but I think at the current moment in time, that there's a great number of science communicators out there, that the landscape is a little bit hostile for a potential newcomer. So you know I'm happy to gain some more experience and wait until the right opportunity comes, as opposed to jumping right in the deep end and trying to compete with everybody else when they're doing a far greater job than I could do at this moment in time.
All right. So I guess that my last question would be: you're currently completing your PhD, your doctorate. What's your dream job or your dream career? Is it doing research? Is it being a professor? Is it being a science communicator? What's your dream job?
So at this moment in time, it's hard to say what opportunities will come my way because of Brexit and COVID and everything else. But what I'd like to do, is carry on working in research. There's nothing I love more than being out in the pouring rain, counting frogs and toads, or spending hot summer days out chasing snakes and lizards. I love being outside. I love collecting that raw data, and then trying to figure out what it all means in the grand scheme of things later on. So that's where I want to remain, whether that is part of an academic institution or an NGO, or you know, and some sort of other organisation. I'm not sure yet, but we'll just have to wait to see what the future brings. I've got 2 years until I finish yet, so there's bound to be opportunities come my way. Uh, so yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I can't wait to carry on doing what I love.
Well, Steve, I'm going to quote you something from Peter Pan, which is all you need is trust and a little bit of pixie dust. So, on that note, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been just a wonderful experience speaking with you. You have a wealth of knowledge. And I mean, we didn't even touch on some of the topics I wanted to talk about, which were turtles, geckos, and lizards, and salamanders, and all that stuff. So maybe,
There's always
if
next
you'd
time.
like, I'd love. I was gonna say, yeah, I would love to have you on the show again because we can we can definitely delve into those topics. So thanks for coming on the program.
You're very welcome.